Hello and welcome to Short-Term Rentals Unpacked, where we go beyond the headlines and break down what they actually mean for operators. This week, the headlines have been dominated by the new EU short-term rental regulation, but the direction of travel is relevant for operators not just across the EU but also in the UK as well. So who better to unpack it with me than Niels Mattisson, CEO of Minute. Niels, welcome and thank you for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me, Ben.
So let's just jump straight into it, right? There's a lot of noise around EU, UK short-term rental regulation, but at a practical level, what is this regulation designed to do and what new powers does it give cities and local governments that they didn't already have?
Yeah, I don't think there's enough noise. I think this is something that has definitely been not given the attention that it needs, because we have seen similar things happen in cities like New York in the US, and the impact there has been quite big. So I think the community here really needs to step up. The new regulation, as I understand it at least, is really just like a registration scheme. So
Okay.
it doesn't put any new restrictions on the books like 90-day caps or primary residence requirements, which are in many places already the law. What it does is give the local government the opportunity to actually enforce these laws. And we have unfortunately seen that there are operators in the industry who work around things like 90-day caps by putting the same property on Airbnb and Booking and Expedia, and maybe they accept direct bookings, making sure that all of the individual channels are shorter than 90 days. But once you have a sort of standardized way to share data between these platforms and a central register, that means that the local government can actually see that you are outside of the regulations. And we've seen the impact of that in New York, right? There was almost, I think, a 2-year gap between when the actual regulation came into place and the enforcement or the tools that enabled enforcement started. And only when enforcement became possible did we see a drastic drop in the number of short-term rentals available. Some estimates I've seen is as much as 2/3 of inventory disappeared.
Wow.
And that obviously was fantastic for the hotel industry, who saw rates go up. And if you've visited New York recently, you know what I mean. It's not cheap.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that makes sense, and I totally agree that a lot of governments just haven't had the tools, right, to actually enforce the rules that they're giving. London being a really good example of that. You know, the 90-day limit was brought in nearly 10 years ago now, and I know a lot of people that ignore it, and I don't know anyone that's ever been penalised for it. So I think a lot of people are likely to have a bit of a shock there. So, for example, if I'm an operator in Paris, Barcelona, Berlin, or London or Manchester, how should I be preparing for this at the moment?
I think the first thing is really to educate yourself. You need to
Okay.
understand what is the regulation in my area. Are there schemes where I need to actually get a license to run my business? And make sure that you are in good compliance. Like, if you are in compliance, then registration is no threat. The problem is if you have been sort of ignoring this and been maybe taking long leases and putting them on the short term market, and done this like a little bit in the sort of the gray zone of what's allowed, because that could come back to bite you. So there is still time here to sort of make sure that you are operating in a legal way. Then taking like one step further, I think this community of short-term rental hosts, like, it maybe hasn't organized as much as it should have, because
Yeah.
these operators bring a lot of good to the local economy, right? Like, you are enabling a different kind of travel. You are helping with peaks in demand during things like the Olympics or concerts. And it's also bringing tourism and people to places where maybe they wouldn't have ventured otherwise. And so there's a lot of good things around this industry, and I'm not sure if that is properly appreciated by local governments everywhere. And if they did, I think some of these regulations might have been a bit more lax. So I always encourage people to, educate yourself, but then also organize yourself. Speak to your peers in the local market, and make sure that you are all helping each other to be the voice of the community towards the local government. Because the opponents, if you will, if you see the more professional accommodation like the hotel industry, they're very organized. So there's going to be a very clear voice that the local government and regulators hear. But if there isn't one from the local small businesses, it's not gonna be an even fight. And I don't think it's gonna have the same weight if the really large tech companies like Airbnb and Booking, like they just don't have that same voice as a local small business in a local economy can. So I think there is a need here for the industry to get together, get a bit organized, and engage with government.
I totally agree with that. Your point there made me think of the area that I used to live in London, which was like a zone 2 southeast London, and around where Airbnb became really popular to stay in these slightly further out locations. We saw a massive increase in the quality of restaurants and shops, and there were a lot of shops that were boarded up with then starting to be taken again. So I don't think that's all down to Airbnb, but I think Airbnb had a huge amount to actually do with it. So yeah, I mean, I think it's fantastic for those local economies. So kind of, with the regulation on paper, it sounds pretty simple, right? You register, you get a number, you display it, but in reality, how easy do we think this process will be for operators?
Well, how much do you believe in government? Like, obviously, it's just a registration scheme. It should be really easy. I'm not convinced that it always will be, but I am an optimist at heart. So I really hope that they do make it easy, and that it's not like a scheme that will require an actual physical visit from a council or these sort of things. It really should just be as straightforward as going online and putting your details and address in and getting a number. But before it's live, it's hard to know what it will actually look like.
Yeah, and I guess it will maybe change territory to territory, maybe or maybe not, because I guess it's an EU incentive, right? So I guess the EU will have their way of doing it, and then the UK will have theirs. But I guess, do you expect this to materially reduce the number of short-term rental listings in Europe and the UK, or does it mainly just clean up a non-compliant supply?
Yeah, it's hard to know how much of the supply is non-compliant because there isn't
Yeah.
this register. Um, the data points that we have are places like Vienna, for example, where
Hmm.
relatively recently there is new regulation coming into play, and then New York. And in both cases, there has been a drop in supply.
Okay.
And so I would expect that. We've also seen similar things happening in Spain, with tens of thousands of short-term rentals being taken off the market. So if the same thing plays out in across the continent as we've seen in specific markets before, then we are going to see a big contraction in supply, and the guest demand is still there. Right? People still want to travel. People still want to experience cities like a local. Right? Like people
Yeah.
don't want to be stuck in a small hotel room. So the demand is still going to be there, and I think it could mean that there is a sharp spike in prices, actually, and I don't think it's going to be very easy to foresee all of the sort of downstream consequences.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that, and I think as well from the buyer side, just having that option. Like personally, I have a young kid, and the idea of him going to sleep at the same time as me in a hotel room is doesn't leave me with a lot of options, right? And I think that's where Airbnb really comes into its own, or short-term rentals in general. Do you think we're entering a more restrictive era for short-term rentals, or just a more professionalized one?
So what I'm hoping, and this is of course like my innate optimism, is that a lot of the laws that we had in place were quite how do you say it, like they were quite coarse.
Mm-hmm.
Something like a primary residence requirement or a 90-day cap essentially makes it very hard to be a professional operator, or
Yeah,
to rent out your second home when you're not using it. If you were reliant on that income to actually pay for it, then it's just not going to work for you. Um, what I think this will expose is that there is a need for these types of accommodation, and it's a very important part of the local economy. And so I hope that by giving the local governments a better tool to enforce their policies, that they can actually enact policies that make more sense in the community. So you don't have these like very simple but very broad types of regulation that essentially can wipe out a whole segment of the market. What I'm hoping for more is that with enforcement, maybe instead of managing supply with sort of a binary yes or no type of regulation, we can rely more on taxes, right? And I think that would make it like easier to regulate depending on what the local city might want, right? Like in a place like Venice, for example, you know, obviously too much tourism. Instead of just shutting down one segment of what is accommodation that people want, and which is particularly good for small business, why not raise taxes? Right? That
yeah,
that way you can get like a better balance between supply and demand. No one, of course, like in business likes taxes, but it's better than a ban in my personal view. And then in a place like we were talking about like the revival of coastal towns, for example, which might have supply. There you could have lower or no taxes and more like a lower touch regulation to actually encourage tourism. And so what I hope, and I think it's probably like a little bit naive, is that the tools to enforce also means that we can have regulation that makes a little bit more sense. But we'll see. What do you think?
I mean, yeah, I mean, we can hope that that's the way things operate. I mean, it makes sense, right? Because I mean, we see high taxes. Not that I'm saying our industry is like this, but we see high taxes on things like cigarettes and alcohol as a way to kind of limit supply, I guess, of those products. And I think a town wouldn't work and wouldn't have character if the entire town was short term rentals. I don't know if you've ever been to St Ives in Cornwall. I personally love it there, but the centre of that town is not in any way Cornish. It's just London by the sea, and it's lost that local spark. And I think lots of other places and these local communities that make them great are at risk of that happening if this industry remains unregulated. And our countries need tax revenues right now, so we may as well kind of kill two birds with one stone there. So yeah, and I think like the clear thing from me, Niels, is that regulation isn't going away, but I think the demand in our industry, it remains strong and is only going to get stronger. And the operators who treat this as a compliance shift rather than a crisis are likely to be the ones still standing in 3 years' time. So yeah, Niels, thank you so much for joining me on the short-term rental unpacked. And if you found this useful and you would like to subscribe to short-term rentals unpacked, where each week we break down what the headlines really mean in the short-term rentals market, then please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you for watching.